Beneath the altar, a headless skeleton, without doubt that of Saint Piran himself, was found and was replaced. Above there is a place for a sort of canopy in which the head was once lodged. It is historically that as late as 1281, the church possessed what was said to be Saint Piran's head, which was kept in a box as a relic, and its absence from under the altar confirms this. I would like to go over the reading of the Manning Times, 1925. Another famous saint, Piran, friend of St. Patrick, crossed over from Ireland to Cornwall sometime between AD 400 and 500 and settled near the sea at a place named after him. The whole of Cornwall so teems with villages named after the saints who ministered on the spot that it has been called the Land of Saints. St. Piran built a tiny church 25 feet long, 13 feet broad and 19 feet to the top of the gables, which in the 9th century was buried in the encroaching sands and so lost for 1,000 years. In 1835, it was found again and uncovered. The sketch from a rare old print shows it as it then was, but much of it was carried away before protection was organized in recent years. Ultimately, it was surrounded by iron rails and later was completely housed in a substantial stone building where it can be seen today. It is undoubtedly one of the oldest Christian buildings in the world. Beneath the altar, a headless skeleton, without doubt that of Saint Piran himself, was found and was replaced. Above there is a place for a sort of canopy in which the head was once lodged. The mention of Saint Piran's skull refers to a religious relic that was a significant pilgrimage item in Cornwall during the Middle Ages, making pilgrimages to a man's skull. It was housed in a silver-bound box at a church in Piran. The skull of Saint Piran was the central object of a major shrine, making shrines after a man's skull. This is Christianity. Along with his wooden staff and copper bell, the site revolved St. Michael's Mount as a pilgrimage destination. We're going to get back into Michael's Mount with Cormoran. The relic was kept in a casket or box bound with iron. An inventory also mentions a silver bow. Now it speaks of an iron box. We're going to get into St. Patrick. The relics were sometimes carried in a procession around Cornwall. In modern St. Piran's Day celebrations, a representation of the skull is sometimes held aloft in a procession across Penhale Sands, honoring a man's skull. That's idolatry, and that's not even a grave image, that's a grave object. The relics were lost at the time of Reformation, and the church where they were housed were eventually abandoned due to encroaching sand dunes. Separately from the historical relic, a modern commercial symbol sometimes seen in Cornwall combines the St. Piran's flag, white cross on a black background, with a pirate skull and crossbones motif. This is a contemporary design and not related to the historical saint or his actual relics, but indeed it does because they are colonizers. Now, we did the stories of the giant Cormoran who was defeated by Saint Michael, where they do the pilgrimage to Saint Piran's skull, who was friends with Saint Patrick. Now, we did the reading of the serpent being locked and chained at Lake Delvine by Saint Patrick, which are the Moors, the serpents, which they spoke of Cormoran and the serpents. I never went over the whole reading, but we're going to go over the whole reading. St. Patrick's final snake killing, the great serpent, the last of his race, they're speaking of the Moors, had his stronghold in the gap of Dunlow. One bright Sunday morning, His Reverence St. Patrick came up to visit the gap, and he met the serpent at the Black Lake. They're speaking of the Moor. "Good morning, St. Patrick," says the serpent. "Good morning, kindly," says St. Patrick. "Well," says the serpent, "will you have me to Gap O'Doonlow and have all the rest of the country to yourself?" "No," says St. Patrick, "I must have the Gap of Doonlow along with the rest." He wants it all. but I'll give you an elegant iron box, so I will for you to live in place of this dirty, nasty gap of Dunlo, says St. Patrick. But if it's so dirty, why do you want it, St. Patrick? Done for a wager, says the serpent. You will never find an iron box big enough for my whole body to get room into. He's speaking about all of the Moors and then putting them in prisons. Done for a wager, says St. Patrick. I'll find the same you's alluding to. But what shall the wager be, says the serpent. I'll hold you a gallon of porter, says St. Patrick, and we'll drink it together, which is agreeable to me, says the serpent, smiling at his reverence. And so St. Patrick went at once and fetched a great iron box, and the serpent looked into it and laughed. Oh, heart, says he, my body will never get into it. Come here and try, says St. Patrick. Well, St. Patrick was so persuading that the serpent went into the box. Faith and I could never fix myself into it, says the serpent, drawing himself back, and I told you the same as I did. Take another chance, man, says St. Patrick. And this the last time I'll cramp myself into your foolishness, says the serpent, as he crawled into the iron box. His reverence was looking on all the time, admiring, and when he saw the serpent nearly in, he slips behind the box and claps the top down onto the infiltrator's tail. Oh, come on, let me out now, Mr. St. Patrick, said the serpent. I'll pay you a gallon of porter, like a man. Indeed, I will. Yes, I will tomorrow morning, says the good St. Patrick. At the same time, he heaves the big iron box into the Black Lake, because he's turning the Moors into the black. And that's exactly what's happening. And ever since at 6 o'clock in the morning, they say you can hear the serpent moaning and asking from on the bottom of the lake, when will tomorrow come? But tomorrow never came, and I suppose it never will. And since then, this place is called the Black Lake. And they speak of blackamoors, where the Moors, they started making them think and call themselves black, dishonoring their foremothers and forefathers. We have the other reading, but this one goes in further. The other reading, the serpent asked, it's a long Monday, St. Patrick. When will you free me? And this reading is from the Union of American, 1876. Now, what you are looking at in these old texts and stories is not folklore in the way it is usually presented. It's not childish fantasy. It is not harmless legend. It is memory, carefully altered, ritually inverted, and then celebrated by these Christians. Indeed, the celebration itself is the key, because what is being celebrated is not simply the victory of saints over monsters, but the conquest of land, the silencing of ancient custodians of knowledge, and the replacement of one spiritual authority with a de facto sense of authority, under the banner of righteousness and salvation through their pilgrimages to skulls and celebrating customs that they know nothing of. They walk in celebration, not realizing what is being celebrated. Let us begin with St. Michael's Mount, which we covered in The Giant of Cormoran. In Cornwall, St. Michael's Mount is presented as a holy place, a site of divine triumph. The story tells us that St. Michael defeated a giant named Cormoran, sometimes called Cormoran the Giant, sometimes softened into a mere monster, sometimes reduced to a fairy tale villain. But older sources tell us something different. Cormoran is not an animal. He is not a beast. He speaks. He rules. He possesses wealth. He commands labor. He inhabits the land as a sovereign figure. And that is why I showed emphasis on St. Piran settling on Cornwall. Cormoran is not a decorative language. It is an identifier preserved just long enough to be uncomfortable, then slowly buried beneath safer words like giant, dark one, or ancient. In mythic language, the word giant is not literal size. It is a symbolic container. It means ancient. It means powerful. It means belonging to a time before the current order. So when the story tells us that St. Michael defeats Cormoran, what it's actually preserving is a memory of displacement. Not the defeat of evil, but the defeat of an earlier authority. And what happens after the defeat? A church is built, a shrine is raised, a pilgrimage is established. and the victory is celebrated annually by people who know nothing of what they're practicing. This is not accidental. Celebration is how conquest becomes holy. Now look closely at the pattern. Saint Michael does not come from the land. He arrives, he appears, he descends, he overcomes, and the land is reconsecrated as his name. This is the same structure we see again and again. Let us move now to St. Piran. St. Piran is called the patron saint of Cornwall. His symbol flies everywhere. His cross is worn proudly, which that flag is not his flag. His story is told of one of faith and survival. But read the oldest accounts carefully. St. Piran does not originate in Cornwall. He comes from Ireland. He washes ashore. He settles. He builds. He is a settler saint on land that already held meaning. His church is buried by sand, covered, lost, then rediscovered. This is often romanticized as a miracle, but symbolically, it tells us something else. Burial and rediscovery is how overriding happens. The older layer is covered. The new layer claims continuity. The past is preserved, but only through the lens of the victor. Then there is the relic, the St. Piran skull. The skull is removed, enshrined, carried, processed. In many ancient traditions, the head represents wisdom, authority, and knowledge. To possess the skull is to possess legitimacy. So when a saint's skull is boxed, guarded, and displayed, what is happening is not only veneration, it is control of memory. Now place this next to another image you were shown, St. Patrick and the serpent. The popular version says St. Patrick drove the snakes from Ireland, but the older newspaper text does not say that. It says the serpent speaks, it reasons, it bargains, it understands contracts, it drinks porter, it asks questions, it fears confinement. This is not an animal. This is a being. And what does St. Patrick do? He does not kill him immediately. He tricks him. He blinds him. He locks him in an iron box. Iron is not chosen randomly. Iron is boundary metal. Iron seals. Iron confines. Iron suppresses. The serpent is submerged in a lake, alive, crying out, "When will Monday come?" This is not only extermination, this is imprisonment. This is silencing. And again, the act is celebrated. Pixies in Cornwall are often described as the first people. That phrase is used deliberately. First people does not mean imaginary. It means prior. Older stories describe pixies as guardians of land, keepers of paths, watchers of sacred lines, being connected to hills, stones, and wells, which they spoke of Cormoran being surrounded by these serpents. Some traditions describe them as following serpent lines, what latter ages would call ley lines, and pixies are depicted later as mischievous, childlike, trivial, as fantasy. One of the most telling images is the pixie with the red cap I showed. Red caps are not random. They are fezzes, and they connect with the Moors again. Red is the color of sovereignty, blood, lineage, power across many ancient cultures, and love. To strip a people, the pixies become small, harmless, laughable, but the red caps remain because erasure is never total. Now return to St. Michael's Mount. Other accounts say the pixies were descended from the first people of the island, and they are displaced when the giant falls. Again, celebration follows. Christian feast days, processions, church bells, all making not only spiritual victory, but territorial conquest. This is what makes these stories uncomfortable. They are not stories of salvation. They are stories of replacement, colonization, genocide, etc. And the replacement is sanctified so thoroughly that questioning it feels like heresy because they're connecting it to the religion. Most people celebrating St. Michael, St. Piran, St. Patrick have no idea that the figures they honor are remembered in older layers as conquerors. Not conquerors of evil, but conquerors of existing systems of knowledge. Saints arrive when something already exists. They do not create from nothing. They overwrite, and overwrite requires justification. So the earlier custodians are transformed. Moors become giants. Giants become monsters. Monsters become fairy tale. Serpents become snakes. Serpents become vermin. Vermin becomes absence. Pixies become child's fantasy. And once transformed, they can be defeated without guilt. That is the function of mystic inversion. That is why the language matters, why Cormoran matters, why Moors of ancient times matter, why the serpent speaks, why the pixies are first people. Because fragments of the truth survive even aggressive revision. And those fragments are what you are seeing in the images and text you've been shown. The celebration is the final layer. Pilgrimages, feast days, people gather to celebrate victories they do not understand, reenacting the triumph of one world view over another, while believing they are honoring goodness itself and God. So this is not only just speaking of fairy tales, this is an observation about historical process. Conquest becomes moral through ritual, and ritual becomes tradition, and tradition becomes unquestioned until someone slows down, until someone reads the older words, until someone notices that the quote-unquote monsters talk, reason, and guard knowledge, until someone asks why the saints always arrive from somewhere else, until someone asks who was already there. That is what this reading is about. Now at the same mount, the same act is repeated. First, a giant is defeated, the one who was already there, who held the land, who possessed knowledge and wealth. His name is Cormoran. In another story, a king appears, King Arthur, and the giant is defeated again. This time, the victory is national, lawful, and celebrated as rightful rule. Finally, the story is lifted out of history entirely. The giant becomes Lucifer. The victor becomes Michael, not as a man, but as an angel. The defeat is no longer about land or people. It is cosmic. It is absolute. But nothing has changed except the name. The same removal is told 3 times at these levels until it can no longer be questioned. What began as the conquest of Custodians became the triumph of good over evil itself. And once the defeated is called a demon, no one is allowed to ask who lived there before the victory, or what knowledge was lost when the mount was claimed. The sage is burning strong in the temple today, brothers and sisters. Hold on. So we're speaking of angels, serpents, Lucifer. Noble Drew Ali says, who were Adam and Eve? They are the mothers and fathers of the human family, Asiatics and Muslim. Where did they go? They went into Asia. What is the modern name for those angels? Asiatics. Are the Moorish Americans any relation to those angels? Yes, we all have the same father and mother. Give 5 names that are given to the descendants of Adam and Eve. Lucifer, Satan, devil, dragon, serpent, and beast. What is the devil sometimes called? The lower self. How many selves are there? 2. Name them. Higher self and lower self. Then Noble Drew Ali states that do not throw away your Bibles. So you have angels who Drew Ali said are a thought of Allah manifested in human flesh. Don't throw away your Bibles, because I'm going to use them to condemn the government. Whenever an angel appears in these scriptures, some major change is happening in the story, but they're trying to make it seem as if it ain't someone who is in human flesh. Drew Ali said an angel is a thought of Allah manifested in human flesh, whose duty is to save nations from the wrath of Allah by spreading the everlasting gospel to the 4 corners of the earth. Because he again states that a prophet is a thought of Allah manifested in flesh. So they're mixing and matching. Even in the modern Islam, when Muhammad was visited by an angel in the cave, he was visited by a prophet or a thought of Allah manifested in human flesh, an angel. But they don't want to give the information of who that was in the human flesh, because then that would make their prophet seem inferior to someone in the human flesh, which the prophets or the angels has always been the Moors, the ones with the ancient wisdom, just like the giant Cormoran. What did God say to Adam and Eve? You eat that fruit, you will surely die. And then the serpent or the devil came upon them and said, you will not die. You will know the truth of life and death. And they ate that fruit and surely they did not die. So who gave them the wrong information? They didn't die when they ate that. They're doing the same exact thing in these mythological stories, trying to bring about mysticism when it comes to who these people are, just like in the Bible, just like in Islam, the modern Islam. But I am happy to say that the Cornish temple is one of the very few custodians of this old-time religion, of this old-time knowledge and gnosis. You go get your most potent Scottish, Irish, Cornish scholars, and you measure on the scale their gnosis against this gnosis that we're demonstrating over here at the Cornish temple, and there is no comparison. I have people every day that make these comments trying to go against these claims, but they have no demonstrations. All they have is their opinion. We put these manuscripts up on the screen. I leave you in love and peace.